afternoon to all the members of the audience. Thank you for being with us today, especially after lunch. It's a complicated time and schedule. Thanks to all of our panelists, Carmen Moreno, Eduardo Núñez, Manuel Alcántara, Navin, Chawla, and Soledad Loaeza. I will not read the resumes, given that the audience already has access to them, and we can go ahead straight to our debate of today. As you may already know, the dynamic here is that you give a brief presentation of 10 minutes, and then we can start a very rich debate on a topic that undoubtedly is one of the greatest challenges of modern democracy: culture and plurality, and social plurality. What lies ahead for legitimacy in democratic regimes? Of course, democracies mean lots of challenges for us today. As we were just saying yesterday during the opening ceremony, in Latin America there are more and more democratic regimes, elections that take a ruling authority to take full possession during their terms. But this is growing in every survey that measures this kind of matters in Latin America. We can see that a dissatisfaction is very evident, a dissatisfaction with democratic regimes. I allow myself to make this question: are we demanding too much out of democracy? Are we asking that democracy solves lots of problems that it didn't have to solve in the beginning? When we're talking about the democratic culture and plural democracy, are we drawing some limits and borders on democracy, or should democracy have no limits at all? Maybe when we are thinking about Latin America, we think about very few countries that truly have some true challenges in this. However, if we think on the challenge that religion minorities are representing in some regimes, we may think about less complicated situations that we should take a look at. Another topic that I think it would be interesting to take into account is, of course, economic inequality, the polarization of income, and the challenges that are set out when we face a democratic regime and the institution of democratic culture. Without making abuse of this word, because it's not my turn to be a panelist, but only moderating this panel, I leave the floor to Carmen Moreno, that is going to make her intervention right now. Thanks for saying yes to our invitation. Thank you. Good afternoon. I will begin by quoting Secretary General Insulza. He said that the state of the exercise of citizenship by the women of the Americas is the thermometer that shows the quality and efficacy of democracy and universality in the continent. Parallel to the consolidation process of the democracy, in the last 30 years, the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean have used a legal framework with the generation of political rights for women. I'm going to present to you a series of questions with the purpose of creating reflection, deep reflection on what it means to be full citizen as a woman in order to work for the future of democracy in Latin America. It is possible? Is it possible to think about a real democracy without the commitment to listen and to include and to embrace the proposals of more than half of the population in our continent? Which are the risks of thinking that representativity and legitimacy of democracy without women? How can we try to legitimize democracy in Latin America without the interests, benefit, rights, and aspirations of women? How do the institutions have to change at the democratic processes in order to include the full diversity of the population in our continent? Are we hoping that the institutions and current processes are adequate to give voice and say to hundreds of millions of people? All these questions should be the core concerns of those that are committed to legitimacy, to governability, and to the elimination of social inequality in our continent. And these are actually the starting point of a new analysis carried out by the Inter-American Commission for Women that has just been published, the citizenship of women in Latin America. This study reflects on the quality of our democracy from the rights of citizenship of the women in Latin America, the English-speaking Caribbean, and Canada, including the political reforms that should be carried out in order to reinforce our democracies. The democratic anomaly that is given due to the scarce presence of women has to do with a variety of problems that have already been presented in the work of the Inter-American Commission for Women, as well as in other specialized bodies, including the report on gender of the electoral observation missions of the OAS. In the center of all these reflections, we have the problem of underrepresentation of women in the agencies where decisions are made with regard to the life of women. And by this, I mean not only health care, even though men are 76% too of the representatives of lawmakers in Latin America. This figure by itself represents an important challenge for the representativity of our democracies, especially if we take into account recent research that show 500 or more years in order to achieve gender equity in politics if we continue at this same pace. In this space, I would like to take a step forward in the consideration of representation, and I would like to put on the table the topic of qualitative representation as a more central dimension for the citizenship of women than just figures. So far as today, we have incorporated women in the political institutions of our countries, in some of them with the use of quota laws or with the gender parity. After almost 2 decades of the creation and application of these special measures, even though they do present limitations, voids, and lack of precision, quota laws have still been implemented. However, the increase in women participation in many countries is still very low. Besides that, we still have the idea that these quotas are a ceiling and not the floor to actually be the true representation of women. Now, with all these advances, the pursuing of political offices by women is still present because women participate in the many institutions, even though negotiations and embracement of additional agendas are not accepted for peace purposes, for security purposes, and for human rights purposes. Based upon the results of the Latin American register, the female citizens of this region are totally non-satisfied with the effectivity and results of democracy. The representation and legitimacy crisis that affects many of our democratic regimes in our region are characterized by the low level of trust and reliability in political parties, the lack of proposals and electoral programs that are substantive and that are linked to the needs of the citizens, male and female, the scarce transparency, the corruption in the management of public funds, the scarce independence of the judicial branch, the lack of mechanisms of accountability mechanisms, the incapacity of parliaments, and the problem of funding electoral campaigns, among others. to progress towards better levels of legitimacy in democracy supposes more internationalization and supposition on how the equality of rights takes place in the plurality of a region. We have to decide if we are going to incorporate women in politics just because of this visual representation, or if we are willing to embrace the new topics, the new agendas, and the new dynamics that women have and have brought into the political debate. Now, we are not only talking about changing women so that they can come into politics, but politics needs to change so that women are appropriately incorporated. This implies a series of reforms to the different functioning of all democracies to guarantee higher levels of participation, representation, and mainly accountability. The word that is hard to translate into Spanish and which actually means a little more than just giving accounts to the citizens of the region. The study by SEAMS has presented a series of recommendations that include several topics, beginning from the strengthening of the rule of law with regard to justice in the political area, including the many manifestations, some of them openly, of political violence against women, including the implementation of parity in all the institutions of democracy, including political parties. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carmen. Without a doubt, it is very difficult for us to speak about a participative democracy that does not include women in equality of circumstances by building this equality. Eduardo Núñez will now have the floor. Would you please? Good afternoon, and thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to share once again called Forum on Latin American Democracy. I would like to speak about the topic from two different points of view that actually addressed the matter in a perfect manner. How to build the legitimacy in all contemporary democracies based upon the Latin American challenges. And I'm going to talk about two different dimensions. The first one is using the logic of designs and dilemmas of democratic design, the Latin American ones, and the other one is from the point of view of the transformation of these societies and how the transformation of Latin American societies demand new ways of construction of democratic legitimacy that go far beyond the elections in its conventional meaning. When we analyze them from the first line of ideas, democratic legitimacy is affected by what I will call a deficit, which is visible throughout 30 years in Latin America. We've talked about them, but let me go through them. First, a democratic culture deficit, which is just the legacy of the gap that exists between the society and the institutions, the society that is still expressing practices and customs and habits, if you want to call them like that are authoritarian and a lack of respect for the authority. So that's the number one deficit, and it's a cultural deficit presented in the citizens. The second one is the state deficit. Latin America is the region of the world where we think that we can have democracies without the state. I don't know if this works in other places of the world, but I don't think. It looks like as we were offering civil and political rights to the citizens in Latin America without precedents in the history of our region, we were contracting and reducing the capacity of the state, including its financial capacity. So we need to think about about it. And number 3, and I think this is also a legacy from the above, it's a deficit of resources. We've talked about it before. And as I said before, this is the legacy of the lack of a state or the insufficiency of the state. I'm talking about the limited results of the things that have been organized. So people is totally unsatisfied with democracy, sometimes because of the politicians, sometimes because of corruption, sometimes because they dislike the institutional organization, but it is usually because their needs have not been satisfied or met in their daily life. So once again, this is what has already been said, a large gap between the citizens and the institutions. In Latin America, we have people that have political rights that are totally full, but they are not economic subjects for other types of development of life. So the first dimension of the problem when building legitimacy is this: the deficit in the design, in the style of development of a democratic model that have already been put on the table, that have already been diagnosed, and that we have to find a way to put an end to them. The second dimension, it's very interesting, and we should elaborate on it, because it has to do with the demand, the way in which the societies have transformed, and these social transformations demand political transformation and democratic transformations. First of all, we are the witnesses of societies that are facing acute processes of differentiation. More than differentiation, we could say fragmentation. And this fragmentation can be seen in the differentiation of interest that creates an overload of demands on political agencies that are fundamental. This overload represents a limitation to the capacity to respond over institutional agencies, and that is why we have this national context of lack of satisfaction. The social complexity added on to the referential point of view of political parties and the politics itself force the creation of new organizations with specific purposes or with general purposes, with permanent purposes or with temporary purposes, that are some of them expressed in peaceful ways and some of them in violent ways. They could be local, national, international, or transnational. So if we had a new mechanic to open institutions, it's like we have that, and it looks like they have something in common. They have a common gene, the gene that they are not willing to give up to politics their representation. They have made the aware and informed decision to represent themselves, and they go beyond the capacity of the political parties to meet their basic needs of political mediator. And the third dimension, this social transformation, has to do with this phenomenon of constant changes in the social reference that we have every day. For example, notions such as the territory, to grow in a community, to socialize as you do it within a family, is totally relative to the new practices of insertion, either national, international, or transnational. For some social groups, their subjective reality could be closer to the social group of a different country than to internal groups that share territory, nationality, and sometimes identity. A fourth dimension or variable would be the growing existence of what I would call multiple members and multiple identities. I can maybe work in politics because of one program, but I may have economic interests that maybe go against with the policy, or maybe I can participate with social assistance groups that have a different purpose or a different way of behaving. Maybe those are one of the factors that could explain why we have this loss of social baseline and the lack of loyalty that is so evident in the relationship of citizens with political parties and with the institutions. And the number 5, without a doubt, is very important, and is the disassociative impact of crime and violence on human life from the individual point of view and from the social point of view. All these variables put together represent the type of society under which politics have to behave and the democratic agencies have to work. Having said that, how can we talk about legitimacy of democracy? Of course, we have a need to close the gaps that have been already identified in the Latin American democratic design. We have talked about this in many other panels, but I want to talk about one thing. I would not be as optimistic as to believe that the electoral matter is something that we all mastered in Latin America. We've made good grades, and I am totally sure that we have progressed a lot on electoral matters. But still, we have regressions and we have problems in our region that cannot allow us to celebrate by saying that we have no threats, that we have no regression on electoral matters. Let's be careful. We have also learned to organize the electoral process, but we have threats that we have to bear in mind. But now I would like to speak about a second way to approach the topic of legitimacy. We need to build up a new logic of action for politics and its relationship with society. And by that I mean, first, to change from the co-opt logic to the participation of parties and societies. With the model of the political parties working with the society. First, with the co-opt method, the institutions did what they had to do, and that was ruled by them. That is not possible in complex society. To understand that now we need to have cooperation is essential, and then to move from the logic of patronage, that if you allow me to express it, or a little cynically, it's been the fuel that has moved the electoral matters. So moving from this order of ideas to the order of ideas of co-responsibility, I think that's very important. A new relationship between the state and the society. And now move from the conventional logic of electoral systems to long-term non-conventional systems, as it has been presented by the report on democracy of the OAS. Number 4, to leave opacity in political management to transparency. Corruption is the cancer that kills legitimacy, and under these contemporaneous contexts is the natural environment that favors the growth of organized crime, which without a doubt is the number 1 threat that Latin American democracies must face. And number 5, to leave the logic of politics as an orchestra made by individuals to a political with an orchestra as a team, where the political parties, the agencies, the stakeholders work together, identify their role, their position, their stance, and they fulfill it with responsibility as the democratic agencies that they are. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we see the need to create or recreate this link between representatives and representees, and how to be able to process all these demands and diverse interests in a democratic system. Manuel Alcántara is now going to have the floor. Thank you very much. Yesterday I already presented the things that I am going to talk about, and now let me pay homage to the leadership of Leonardo Valdez. Leonardo, I think that you can feel totally satisfied. You are one of us. You have set your print in this institution, and congratulations. To speak about legitimacy, it's to speak about power. It's to speak about power as something that is related between the individuals and institutions. However, to speak about legitimacy is also to speak about efficacy. There's a reality that is totally symbiotic between these two terms. And please allow me to also pay homage to Juan Liu, who left 10 days ago and who is a fundamental author to understand this reality. Please, a round of applause for this late author. However, the question that is here framed for this panel is being framed in a very precise environment, and that is the relationship between culture and social plurality. And now let me talk about my point of view. And I think that it actually incorporates we have to include the variable known as culture here. We have talked in previous presentations in this panel about the variables that are more institutional, more political. But I'd like you to think about another way of looking at it. Culture has an incredible link when we talk about culture and social plurality with the idea of identity. Identity is the baseline of all political processes. Identity is, besides that, something that has an additional component, just as I said with the power, and that is the relationship of the individuals that have the identity and the society that somehow gives logic and makes sense to that identity. We know very well that identity means values, symbols, and traditions. Identity means beliefs. And all these is fundamental in order to understand and articulate politics. Without values, without beliefs, without symbols, without myth, we cannot have politics. And in this order of ideas, there are two elements that have played a very relevant role in the last years. And those are the ones that I am going to talk about. We cannot have identity without memory. And we cannot have identity without having the acknowledgement of others. The fact of not having identity without memory is very well explained because and seen with the opening of what we call the historic memory. I come from a country in which a week ago there was an event. We read this news. Spain is the second country in the world with tombs of unknown people. Number one is Cambodia. So the topic of the historic memory is basic in order to have identity. So we know who we are, where we come from, and where we're going to. I think that everything that has been articulated in Latin America that's been pioneered in the commissions of historic memory has set the road to be followed in this matter. Likewise in Argentina, it's a good road and it's once again being articulated in Colombia. I think that the acknowledgement of the victims of terror that was caused by politics in a given time, it's fundamental to build this historical memory. The second one is the acknowledgement of others. The acknowledgement of others is based upon the configuration of the political community. And it is so important that it supposes the clearest scenery of construction and one of the soundest meanings in political science in the last centuries, and that is the concept of nation. Nation is equal to national identity and has a remarkable thrust since the 18th century to date. And the great political success of this is the capacity to build the state of a nation. But we know that cultural identity also has a force, I would say, so sophisticated that it ends up unraveling these concepts that we thought could not be questioned. And it is produced in two different levels, the questioning. One, the so-called supra-regional terms and the infra-regional or national terms. So which are the challenges? Which are the elements that we have to use to question cultural identity from the supranational level? First of all, we have just learned for the history of humanity, but since the treaties of Rome in the 50s and the integration processes carried out in Latin America and other places, the processes that we know that are for regional integration that give place and give content to a certain type of identity totally different to the national one. And in the case of first the common market and then the economic community and then the European Union, it's the European identity that is marked up by cultural components, but not only that. And there are other type of essays about entity that have been created. The very last one, which I think was a failure, is the one that has to do with the polyvariated identity. To think that this identity has been articulated based upon the old mother country. But all these things happened side by side of these integration processes which represent a new culture. And maybe the most important one of all those in the last 25 years is what we could call the identity of the globalized individual. It's a not very well defined identity that under the umbrella of the technological development, especially telecommunications, has managed to create a finishing with certain type of transversal beliefs that are present throughout the continents. And another type of supranational identity that also played an important role is the religious identity. I never presented it as such because I think that the value of religion is to create identities that go beyond borders. However, this identity, it's an old identity, but we are seeing that it is present in the churches, in the evangelized, in the witnessing churches, and are actually going beyond borders. So now, going into infranational terminal terms, there are two classical visions that have identified very strong identities. Number one, the ethnic ones that have given place to the flourishment of political expressions that are known as plurinational states. And we have examples in Latin America, but in Asia, the tradition is much more important and maybe is not as studied or as highlighted. Think about a country as Indonesia, where they have these particularities of their ethnia, and it is also a country that is made up by several islands. And the second type are the tensions that have to do with language, that have to do with things such as, with places such as Canada, with Quebec, or the Indian and European case, and the case of Spanish with Bascos and Catalanes. And the common denominator of all these flourishment of cultural identities is always the great difficulty to define the we. So who are the ones that are identical? And based upon that, which are the mechanisms of articulation of legitimacy that are going to be created? If we are going to have new ones, just remember what Boehmer said, if there are other different to the three elements of legitimacy that were produced by him. To answer to the question, culture and social plurality, what's the future of legitimacy in democratic regimes? For me, the future of legitimacy is to find this new us, this new we must. I think there are other types of authors. It's a global identity that cannot go back, that has to be very close to the root. So it's a combination of global and local, and this is the challenge that we have to face in the 21st century politics, or maybe not the 21st, but the 22nd.
Thank you very much. Undoubtedly, there's a tension between what is individual, what's particular, and what is social in building these new demos, this new population, which is generating new difficulties for us. I would like to ask Navin Chawla to take the floor. Navin, thank you very much for being with us today.
Distinguished panelists,
Distinguidos panelistas,
ladies and gentlemen,
damas y caballeros.
first my tribute to Dr.
Primero,
Leonardo
quisiera
Valdez
agradecer a Leonardo Valdés
and Senor Manuel
y al
Carrillo
al organizador Manuel
for
Carrillo
choosing so carefully
por elegir tan
such an important
cuidadosamente
subject,
este tema
sensitive
tan
subject,
importante y
thoughtful
delicado, que también es
having
importante,
come all the way from India,
y
I
que
have to say
viniendo yo
that
desde
for the first
India,
time
debo
in
decir que
attending
por primera
so many
vez
forums, I
en
have not come
por
across
primera vez
such thoughtful
en
subjects
la vez en la que
which
he
have
atendido a
drawn
tantos
me
foros
here.
como estos, es la
So
primera vez
thank
que
you
se
and
tocan
thank you to the
temas tan
Secretariat.
importantes como estos. Muchas gracias y gracias a la
I
Secretaría.
was also very grateful
También estoy
to
muy
Dr.
agradecido
Leonardo Valdez
con el doctor
for
Leonardo
coming to
Valdés
India
por haber
for
ido
our
a
Diamond
India
Jubilee.
para nuestro
Came all
jubileo
the
de
way,
diamante.
and he was one of
Vino
us,
y
and I
fue
have
parte de
been
nosotros,
to
y
Mexico 3
yo
times.
he venido a
Of
México
course, I
3
look
veces.
Mexican,
Por
but I
supuesto me
also
parezco a un
feel
mexicano,
Mexican.
y por supuesto me gustaría sentirme
Now-
mexicano ahora.
Now I'm going to begin,
Ahora
but
me
I'm
gustaría
also going to
comenzar
end with the story of 6
con
remarkable
la-
women in my country.
Con una historia de
Not
6
all of
mujeres
them are
muy
alive.
importantes de mi país. No todas de ellas están
Mother
vivas.
Teresa,
La Madre Teresa,
Sonia Gandhi,
Sonia Gandhi,
our former president Pratibha Patil,
nuestra expresidente,
the
señora
chief
Patil,
minister who's like
el
governor
ministro
of
principal que es
Tamil
como
Nadu, Miss Jayalalitha,
la gobernadora, Miss
the chief
Jenalita,
minister
el
who's like the governor
ministra que es como el
of West
gobernador
Bengal,
de
Mamta Banerjee,
del Bengala del Este,
and a former chief
señora
minister of UP
Anta,
called
y
Miss
finalmente
Mayawati.
con la señora Maya
6
Kuriboni.
important
6
So I'm going to
importantísimas
come back to them
mujeres.
and conclude with
Voy
them.
a
But now
regresar
I'll take you
a
before
ellas
I come to them
al
and
concluir,
to
pero
how they
para
have fit
comenzar les
into
voy a
India's
hablar
complex
en cómo
cultural
han
matrix.
entrado ellas en
I
la
would
matriz
take you
tan
first
compleja
a
de la
little
India.
bit in
Primero
my
las voy
10
a
minutes
llevar
to
en mis breves 10 minutos
a
que
portrait of
ustedes-
India.
a darles una
It's a
imagen de la
very
India.
complex country.
Es un país muy
Not just
complejo.
1.2 billion
No
people,
solamente uno
but
de 1.2
complex
mil
for the
millones
last
de
5,000
habitantes,
years.
pero ha sido complejo durante los últimos
We're a
5,000
new
años.
country.
Somos un
We
país
gained our
relativamente
independence
nuevo.
in
Nuestra independencia
1947.
la obtuvimos hasta en
We adopted a
1947
constitution in
y
1950,
promulgamos una
but
constitución
we
hasta
are a very
1950.
ancient
Pero somos una
civilization,
civilización muy
a
antigua,
very ancient culture.
una cultura
The
muy
culture of
antigua,
the Northeast,
una cultura
the
del
Southwest,
noreste, del
the South,
sureste, del
the North
suroeste, del sur, del
are
norte.
different,
Todas son
but they have come
diferentes,
together
pero
through
se
the
han unido
Constitution,
gracias a la
through
Constitución,
language,
gracias
and
al
through the
idioma
power of the
y
vote.
gracias al poder del voto.
In our In our history of the last 1,000
En
years,
nuestra historia del último
there were many
milenio,
kingdoms
hubo
and
muchos
many attempts
reinos
at
y muchos
self-government.
intentos de
So this is not
autogobierno.
the first
Esto
attempt at
no es el
self-government.
primer
There have been
intento
many
de
strands of
autogobierno.
self-government
Ha
in
habido
our
ya
country
muchos,
over
décadas de
1,000
autogobierno en
years
este país durante los
of
últimos
recorded
1000 años
history.
de la historia que tenemos en papel
We
escrita.
have 4 major castes and
Tenemos
lots of
4
minor
castas
castes.
principales y algunas
Now,
castas
the
menores.
caste system is
El
now
sistema de
abolished,
castas ya
but
no
it
existe,
exists.
está abolido,
On
pero
the
sigue
top,
existiendo.
we had the
En lo
Brahmins,
superior
the
tenemos los
priests,
brahmanes, los
as you did
sacerdotes,
have in Mayan culture
de
in
la misma
Mexico.
manera en que ustedes los tienen
At the
en la
second
cultura
level
maya.
were the
En el
warriors,
segundo nivel
the
tenemos a los
fighters.
guerreros.
At the third level,
En el
there
tercer
were
nivel tenemos
the
a
people
los-
who engaged in trade
a
and
las
business.
personas, a
But
los
the last
comerciantes.
level,
Y en el
bottom,
último
were the
nivel
untouchables of
tenemos
India
a los
who did
intocables,
all the dirty work.
personas que hacían todos
And
los
they were not
trabajos
allowed to live
sucios,
where the
que
upper
no
castes
tenían
lived.
permiso de
So, and they were not
vivir
even
donde
in many
las
parts of the
demás castas
country
vivían, no
allowed
podían
to
vivir
look
en
at the
otros-
upper caste.
Pero
That
tenían
is
que
where
vivir
we
en
came
otros
from.
países en otras zonas
So
del
when we
país y ver a
adopted
los
our
demás castas
constitution
hacia
in
arriba.
1950,
Pero
we
con
abolished
nuestra
this.
Constitución de 1950
And we eliminated the
logramos
caste
abolir
system.
esto. Desintegramos el
But in
sistema de
order
castas.
to catch up
Pero
with
para
3,000 years of
poder
history,
actualizarnos con los
we
últimos
reserved
300 años de historia,
33% of all government jobs
53%
for the
de
scheduled
todos
castes
los
and 10%
empleos
for
en
the
gobierno.
scheduled tribes. We
Y otro
reserve
tanto
seats in parliament for them.
10%
We have 543 member seats
miembros
in
de
our
tribus. Tenemos
lower house.
53 curules en
84
nuestra Cámara de
stand reserved
Representantes
for the scheduled caste
84
and
están
47
definidos para
for the scheduled tribes.
una de las
Unfortunately,
castas y
we
otros
never
para
reserved
la
seats
casta
for
según
women.
y el resto
And an
para
effort
otro tipo
now
de
to reserve
castas y mujeres.
30% for
Ahora,
women
al reservar
is
50 el-
facing
designar
great
53%
resistance
para las
from
mujeres
the men,
nos difiere mucho de los sistemas
which is very
que
sad.
tienen a los
But I
hombres.
hope
Las
one
mujeres.
day
Esto es algo muy
that
triste.
barrier will
Espero que
also
algún
break
día
down.
también logremos superar esta barrera.
The system of equalization,
El
of
sistema
plurality
de
of culture,
igualizar y la
of
cultura y la
making a
pluralidad,
level playing
pluralidad,
field
y hacer
has been
una
assisted
cancha
by our very
nivelada
strong
para todos,
institutions.
nos hace
We have a
instituciones-
very, very
necesitamos
strong
instituciones muy
election
fuertes.
commission.
Tenemos un
We have
muy
very
fuerte
powerful
comisión
courts.
electoral, tenemos
Supreme
tribunales
Court
muy
and the High
fuertes,
Court
un tribunal
have
supremo
grown
y un
into
tribunal superior,
strong institutions
que
which
son
people
instituciones muy
respect.
fuertes a las cuales la gente respeta.
Apart from that, we have a
Aparte de
separation
eso,
of
tenemos
powers,
una separación de
and
poderes,
we have a very
y
vital
tenemos
and press and a very strong middle class.
una clase media muy
Amartya
viva.
Sen wrote a book called The Argumentative Indian, and it is true. We
cierto
Indians
que
argue
nosotros, los
all the
indios,
time, a bit like the Mexicans. But I mean,
somos
we
muy
have a
como
view
los
on
mexicanos,
everything.
tenemos un punto de
If
vista
you stop
para
somebody
todo.
on the
Si
street
paras a una
and you
persona
ask
en
the
la calle y
person
le
for a
preguntas,
view,
¿cuál
he
es tu
has
punto
about
de
4
vista? Por
views
supuesto
at
que tiene
any
un punto
time
de vista
on
de
all matters.
cualquier
Now,
tema,
what
sobre
that has
cualquier cuestión,
become
en cualquier
is a
momento.
solid
Lo que
middle
ha hecho
class,
esto es una clase
which have
media
views,
muy sólida
they're
que
on
tiene
Twitter,
puntos de
they're
vista.
on
Por ejemplo,
Facebook,
tenemos a
they're
gente en
sharing their
Twitter, en
opinions,
Facebook, están
they're
compartiendo
writing,
su
they're
opinión,
speaking, they're
están
traveling.
escribiendo, están viajando,
That's about
están haciendo
300
escuchar.
million Indians.
Estamos
But
hablando de
300
cerca de
million
300
Indians
millones
are
de
also
personas
very
en la
poor.
India. Pero son también 300
They
millones
are
de
the,
personas que
they
son
are the
muy
poor of
pobres.
Mother Teresa, whom I
Son los
also
pobres
reach out
a los
to in a
que
small way.
la Madre Teresa ayudó y que yo
They
también ayudé de
have
alguna
no
manera.
housing,
No
no
tienen
social
acceso a
security,
casa, a
hardly
seguridad
any
social, por
education,
supuesto que
no
casi no tienen
jobs,
educación, no
not
tienen
enough
empleos,
food.
no hay
So
suficientes
successive
alimentos.
governments
Entonces,
have brought
las
about the right to
sucesivas
employment,
administraciones han
the
tratado
right
de dar
now
derecho
to
de
food.
un trabajo y también el derecho a la
74% of our
alimentación.
population
74%
is now
de
going to
nuestra
be giving.
población ahora va a
It
empezar
started
a
already a
recibir,
few weeks
más
ago.
bien, ya empezó a
It's
recibir desde
recent,
hace unas
but they're going to be
semanas, esto es algo
given.
reciente. Están
They're going to be given
comenzando
food grains
a
at
recibir
virtually no price. It's a
alimento
big,
prácticamente sin
it's
costo.
a big drain on the exchequer. Where is the money going to come
De
from?
esta manera
But we
van
have
a
to be able
recibir
to
algo de bienes
also
y vamos a ser
curb
capaces de
our
poder
corruption in
eliminar la
order to
corrupción
be able
para
to provide food and livelihood to the very poor.
y un modo de vida a
Like
nuestros-
developing countries,
nuestros
we have a great level of
ciudadanos. Los
corruption.
países en
But because we have a vibrant middle class and a very powerful press, more powerful than the UK, for instance, more powerful than in France, much more powerful than in Mexico, and more noisy than the United States. That sort of press with 1,000 channels and 300 news channels is constantly unearthing corruption, it's breaking news. And the middle class is now, in a way, it's come of its own. I do not know if you read, about a year ago, there was a horrible rape in our country. A young girl was raped by 5 men, one of whom was a teenager, and she died. Oh, there are many rapes in our country. Most go unreported, but this rape stirred the imagination of the whole country, and hundreds of thousands of young people converged in public spaces all over India to say enough is enough. So as a result, new legislation has come, faster courts have come. But the illustration I'm giving is that there is a young and angry population that is educated, that is the fruit of 8% growth for the last 15 years. It empowers 30 million people a year into the educated middle class. And that voice can now not be stopped. And every single government that comes has to pay heed to that voice. So there's one voice of the mobile phone. But today, as you go down into India, even the poorest young people, everybody has a mobile phone in his hand because that doesn't cost very much money. So we're all in communication. We have problems of corruption that you have here, and until we don't have sunlight, we can't, and means of transparency, no society is going to be able to get rid of it. But when young people get angry, as the young of my country are getting angry, that is the biggest deterrent against corruption. I want to say a few words about the power of the vote. In 1947, I told you that we had our depressed class. They had no vote. They had no voice. Suddenly we gave them the vote. Now the politician had to go out to them, even if the politician belonged to the upper caste. And so the politics and tradition began to change from one of confrontation to one of reconciliation. Now, since I have 1 minute, I'm going to talk about these 6 women. We have Mother Teresa, born an Albanian, becomes an Indian, is completely accepted into the cultural concept of India. We all loved her. Everybody worked for her. She was Indian. We have Sonia Gandhi, Italian by birth, but she speaks Hindi better than me. She understands India. I don't even think she has many Italian friends left. She's completely Indian. But the country has absorbed her. So what is there in the country that has caused that to absorb her? We had a president, Pratibha Patil, for 5 years. She wore long blouses. She covered her head. But still, when she would go into a Spitfire plane with the Air Force, she would put on a helmet, put on what the Air Force told her to wear, and she was able to reach out to another kind of India. Then we have Mayawati, who was the Chief Minister of UP, scheduled caste, not married, no children, no family. So she, when she has public meetings, she will stand there sometimes wearing a crown of diamonds, like a huge tiara, not because she is going to carry it with her to her grave, but to show her people who were depressed for so many thousands of years that she too can wear diamonds. It becomes a symbol. It's not just the diamond. We have a chief minister today in West Bengal. She's a street fighter. She used the methods of the communists to overturn them. She dresses in a sari that costs 10 rupees or 20 rupees. She walks practically barefoot. She's a street fighter. She never had any family behind her that gave her a role in politics. She brought out her own. And finally, we have a politician in Tamil Nadu, Miss Jayalalitha, Brahmin. But she has taken control of the Dravidian movement. She too she's not married. So all these three remarkable women who are chief ministers of states are not married, and yet they reflect what I call the merging into the culture and plurality of India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Navin Chawla. Now we leave the floor to one of our hosts, Soledad Loaeza. Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much to the head of the board of the IFE, to Manuel, organizer of the International Affairs of the IFE, and to all the organizing institutions for your invitation to come to this fourth forum in which we are discussing topics that are very relevant for the future of democracy in Latin America. The topic in this session is based on the issues set out for democratic institutions when talking about the transformation of institutions in the last 30 years. My reflections will be limited to three main topics. First, the change and modification of values and attitudes in political matters. Second, the collective actors that are setting out some problems for the Republican value of equality. And thirdly, I would talk about some reflections on legitimacy in fragmented societies. The societies at the beginning of the 21st century are very different to those which were governed or ruled by the liberal governments of the second half of the 20th century, because they are not guided by citizens, but because they are guided by some citizens who have no limits because of their economic status or conditions, or an ideology in particular, but just because of an affiliation of diversity, whether gender preference, gender percent, sexuality, age, etc. And they seem to look at different topics, whether environmental to all kinds of inclusion. All these kind of collective groups have not enough citizens, and I think they have developed a coexistence that is I think it is difficult and tense. It has created some tensions within democracies. In the same way in which the growth of liberalism accentuated neoliberalism, the fragmentation of interests has been fed by some difficulties which translate into disagreements. In my way of saying this would explain the inefficiency of traditional institutions such as political parties to articulate and represent the interests that have been organized based on an identity or a topic in specific. I don't think that the crisis of political parties that we've seen in this document is generated from a corruption of these institutions. I think it is arising from somewhere else. Nonetheless, and based on this assumption that I'm doing, I don't think that political parties may be substituted in the solution and organization of the central topic of this competition for power. How are we going to solve? How is this competition going to turn out? This is crucial for any societies. I believe that political parties are still key to solve this problem in particular. Yes, it's true that political parties that answer to masses are in crisis. And I believe that more than a crisis, I believe they are affected because of the social transformations. This hasn't happened with the largest parties. We need to make a difference between these two, because parties for the masses are those who have a less flexibility to give an answer to these shifts. And I dare to bet that in the future we will see that this kind of parties, liberal parties, and uncentralized, those parties that are open and flexible, and whose activities are limited to the electoral act and to the election or a particular act, should strengthen their presence and the struggle for power in choosing legitimate authorities. I don't think that political parties would be as the ones in the past. Those parties for masses of the 20th century, which had a closed universe in which its members were educated since they were children up to their grave. That age is over. What is now in game is, I'm sorry, it's not in game, it's assured, is that those parties have a very precise and specific function, that is an objective, that is to win elections and organize the elections. The masses, the parties for the masses are oriented to a massive production that is has a trend of disappearing. I believe that in the social context, these resources have transformed and they show a tendency to encourage individualism. To support what I'm saying, I will quote Flavia Friedenberg, who just said this morning that a politician of nowadays that doesn't have contact with social networks such as Twitter is totally lost. I believe this is true, and in this case, parties for the masses have no room left for them. In the past years, the education and training of political party members has changed. They used to educate its members based on an utopia or some ideology that is no longer in force. There is no way to change this transformation, not even in such closed regimes such as in the Chinese regime. However, I don't think that the problems of democracy don't have an answer or can't be solved. It seems to me that they have to do more with this adjustment of the political institutions and these social transformations. I dare to say that non-governmental organizations are here to stay as the main players in political life. I believe also that their action should shift towards a political participation that is different to that of the vote. I am thinking about the possibility that this promotes such figures and that they act in contexts in which they introduce figures such as the plebiscite and referendum, which are designed to treat different topics, to treat topics that are different from those in the elections. The document that we've been talking about talks a lot about inequality, save for Canada. There's another kind of inequality that is such as anti-democratic as economic inequality. It's that that generates the existence of these collective actors which are undermining a crucial Republican value that is politicized activity. They don't have the same elements or resources to take part in the government, to make negotiations with governments. These collective groups or organizations have different instruments that they bring to the game and that give them a different kind of way in this scale, in a way that each of these groups will have a differentiated treatment, which is what they are aiming for. So I'm not very happy with the idea that we have these political actors with different identities, because I believe they are taking part of a very important position with regards to core values of democracy. And the last topic that I'm going to be mentioning is that of the construction of legitimacy in fragmented societies. I believe it's a very remarkable question. How are you going to build legitimacy in societies with more multiple identities? My answer is we have to do it in the many ways in which legitimacy is written. Legitimacy is constructed not only on election day. It's based on different acceptation bases, such as the vote in the ballots, but also of a democratic community that avails and accepts the results of an election, but it's also respectful of political diversity and the existence of an opposition. At the same time, this democratic culture, this legitimacy is going through an agreement generated by the government that complies with its commitments. If a government is meeting those promises that they made, they will have some legitimacy in the same way in which democracy or a certain government or political party can also have some historical legitimacy. So I'm not very worried about the kind of legitimacy that could be demanded by these societies that are made up of such diverse groups, because I believe that there are several kinds of legitimacy, and these are not limited just to the votes in the votes. I believe also that the democratic legitimacy has to do with the weaknesses of electoral processes. The question here is if a government can survive with just one kind of legitimacy. I believe the answer is no. It is very difficult to find a historical element of a government that could retain the authority and power with just one legitimacy tool. The third question is that if we can achieve consensus in this kind of societies. First of all, I don't agree with the idea that democracy is in crisis. Liberal democracy is in crisis, as are the reforms that were introduced at the end of the 1990s. I don't think democracy is in crisis, or that the democratic values are in crisis, because we don't have an alternative to democracy. In that measure, democracy is not threatened. That would be one of my answers. The other one is that I believe that there exists and coexists a consensus that is basic with regards to the fundamental values of democracy, that of participation, plurality of societies. We don't think that a society is homogeneous, and I believe there's also a consensus with regards to the respect to those differences as a main component of a society that's more or less normal. Maybe I am optimistic when seeing at this document. I don't think there's a crisis of democracy, because we haven't modified this basic agreement that made place to authoritarian regimes. Up till now, I think that while there is a certain dissatisfaction about the performance of democratic institutions, if we take a look at the results such as the Latin barometer, attitudes towards democracy are more positive during electoral periods. When we see the electoral democracy in movement, there is an agreement on that mechanism so that they can get to the power. I would say that in these plural societies, there's no way to go back. The worry about vehicle is at its most basic thing, an opposition. We are celebrating diverse societies, but at the same time we have some nostalgia for unifying vehicles. I ask myself, do we really need a unifying vehicle that goes beyond the basic democratic values that are basic for the functioning of a democratic regime, together with plurality and the idea that to attain the power, we only need to go towards electoral processes or to the respect of differences and the existence of an opposition. Thank you very much. Thank you, Soledad. Of course, It is not uncommon to listen about legitimacy in plural, but as you say, and you set out in your idea of plurality and several sources of legitimacy for a democracy with basic agreements, there are some questions from our audience. Some of them are aimed at, directed towards one of you in particular. I would like to read them out loud and go backwards so that you could give an answer to these questions. And if you want to give an answer to some of these. Firstly, to Navin Chawla, do you believe the problem of corruption is possible to fight it, especially in a country such as Mexico, in which it is socially accepted? What do we need in a country such as this to change this acceptance of corruption? Now, for Eduardo Núñez and Soledad Loaeza, what is the role of basic elementary education systems in Latin America in the development of presidential systems? I think it says unilateral and partidist presidential systems. Now, for Manuel Alcántara, how can we take advantage of the globalizing political culture, since this implies that cultures are immersed into a media noise that is making it difficult to establish a political identity? We have another question. How should we set out a future with legitimacy when there are different demos that that want a legitimacy of their own, and that they legitimize majorities or the other groups and other socio-political groups? And is this not a threat against democratic governance, that of trying to incorporate the majority? Now we have another question discussing the importance of social cohesion and the tiredness of social linkages due to a national and international environment that is more hostile each time. What is the role of the design of national cultural policy and all other policies that could stem from this? I think that this allows to a great debate. This other questions has already been said, talks about the identity of a new demos. What should these demos be based on? Now we're going backwards. You have 5 minutes each. We start with Soledad.
What's the role played by the basic systems in Latin America with which presidential systems are developed? I think that the question is made based upon authoritarianism. Is that correct or not? Could someone elaborate on the question, please? So my answer is, actually the school does not necessarily convey authoritarian values. I think that the first authority faced by a child is the family. There's a hierarchy in the family, the father, the mother, etc. So I think the family plays an important role in the development of attitudes before the authority. In schools for basic education, in Mexico elementary school education, the image of the president of the republic has been sort of the importance to that post has not been that important. It's been changed in the book text, not anymore. It has disappeared from the text, from the book text. And And we talk about plurality, we talk about elections, and we talk about competition for power. As far as I know, the textbooks that I know do not promote an authoritarian culture. Thank you.
Corruption is a very big problem in my country.
Es un problema muy importante en mi país.
And there is no easy solution,
En realidad
no
no
easy
existe una
answer.
solución fácil, no existe una respuesta fácil.
What we need is more and more
Lo que
transparency,
necesitamos es
more and
mayor
more
transparencia,
institutions that promote
mayor
transparency.
instituciones
We
que
need
den
sunlight
transparencia.
on corruption.
Necesitamos la luz del sol sobre
One
la
great
corrupción.
starting problem of corruption in
Un
India
problema inicial de
is that
corrupción
our
en India
elections have become very expensive.
es que las elecciones ahora son
Although
sumamente caras.
we have a
pesar de
statutory
que
limit,
tenemos
most
un
candidates and
límite
most political
legal,
parties,
pero de
they breach those limits by far, and it is very difficult for us to catch. So how do we bring spending during elections to acceptable limits? One of the examples I give is an example of Mexico. I have spoken many times, I have studied many countries. I am not saying Mexico is perfect, but I am saying, and I say this in India, that how do we bring about public funding of elections now? To take that out, that free spending, and put it back into the bottle is difficult. But I am suggesting models of public spending from different countries. And one of the things that IFE does is that you give free time, equal time, or proportional time according to how you worked it out, 70%, 30% to different candidates depending on the ratios and strengths of their parties. Now we have a lot of free media, but we need to get some kind of an IFE model in order to be able to see whether at least people get equal opportunity or proportional opportunity on television and radio. The other second way is that our institutions have become stronger and stronger. We have a powerful election commission, very powerful Supreme Court. 1 month ago, the Supreme Court of India passed a very important order. Our legislators tried to thwart it, but that didn't happen. The result is that now if a politician goes to jail, then that politician is debarred from power for that jail term, of course, plus 6 years after that. So last week, a very powerful Indian politician went to jail for the first time, and in effect, by the time he comes out of jail and those 6 years go by, his political career will be over. A few days ago, another prominent politician went to jail. So now with this important, vital step that the Supreme Court has enacted, we can see the cleansing of our political establishment from its criminal elements. Because criminal, muscle, money, these are what are spoiling our political landscape. And I am still idealistic enough to believe that as our institutions become so strong, and no parliament can now say something to the Supreme Court. No parliament or parliamentarian or prime minister could possibly say anything to me when I was Chief Election Commissioner. I mean, it just demonstrates the growing strength. Maybe with these measures and with, as I mentioned earlier, a stronger, articulate middle class, we may be able to see that public anger against corruption will also have the effect of cleansing our system. Thank you.
how to take advantage of globalized political culture. What characterizes globalization from the point of view that I presented is that globalization gives us all a technological support that has universal vocation and that is easy to use. So it's sort of a democratic tool, a very democratic tool. Online, I think that maybe we are seen in a small town in India or in a small town in Spain. And this supposes immediate shared information. And by that I mean immediate information. And immediate information ends up being a fundamental element of an active citizenship, of a citizenship aware of what's going out around it. And with that information they can define others and they can reconstruct the memory. Today it is very easy to reconstruct our memory because there are several contributions in the cyberspace that share their own memory. And this also takes us to the point that with this democratic tool, it's easy to also spread out our values. But maybe you are going to say you are way too optimistical, because we all know that online, the main load online is pornography. And I'm not talking about those values as the ones that should be shared. Of course, those are not the values that I'm talking about. Yes, everything has a dark side. However, answering the question on how to take advantage of it, that's what I think. Another question, if I understood it correctly, is the role of cultural national policies. And here my question is, what's nation? What do we understand by national cultural policy? Of course we understand what a cultural national policy. Cubans have these cultural policies all the time. I don't know how long it's going to last, but probably the Catalan TV in Spain also makes its own cultural policies. But I'm not talking about those. When I was talking about the nation, I was talking about other type of challenges and elements. For example, in today's press or medias, we can see that the presence of the Cervantes Institute in the United States is going to happen thanks to the mass incorporation of Mexican professors to teach Spanish. That's a cultural policy, but it is not a national one from the traditional standpoint point of view, because it has to do with the language, and the Spanish is the heritage of millions of people. So the role of those supranational cultures that I was talking about is the one that we need to follow up. And yes, it is true that they are going to coexist with the micro, with what I was saying about the local, but the scope that I see is that cultural supranational policies are going to have more force. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manuel. Eduardo Núñez, the floor is yours. I'm going to be very concrete. The question about the role of the academic systems, the education. Well, academic entities may fulfill the role of conveying change or conveying stagnation. Of course, they can reproduce authoritarian models, machista models, racism, Of course, they can do all that, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the power to also be a transformation factor, and especially when talking about learning the new processes. An academic system with an appropriate scope could be, first of all, the factor with which we're going to build up entities in plural, not entity. The development of values and practices that can actually be common values, common practices, democratic practices, and without doubt, from those two factors, turned into an inclusive factor, social integration. Here, we have to ask, what's the purpose of them, and try to have or focused more centered into the content and not in other things. A second reflection that I would like to give you as conclusion from my point of view that I think came in one of the questions has to do with the relationship of these new societies and the need to acknowledge differences and the topic of democratic governability. And the answer to that is, without a doubt, to acknowledge the differences, to acknowledge interest and to protect the interest of the minorities. The values expressed represent a lot of challenges from the point of view of governability, and we cannot be naive and think otherwise. The new democratic societies can be built up based upon acknowledgement and recognition of differences. We have to forget about uniformity. We have disguised it in many ways with ethnic identities, with national identities, and many other names. Of course, we can have national values. Of course, we have ethnic entities, but there are other interests that also present more differences in our societies. And it's fundamental that the new societies acknowledge those new differences. The new logic is to acknowledge the difference, to respect the difference, and once it is acknowledged and respected, then we can identify values and interests that can be shared or that are shared, but not by denying the differences as we've done it in our region many times. The topic of the natives represent a lot of these problems. Most of the Latin American systems, including the democracies, have been built up without taking into account the vision, the interest, and the needs of the natives. That's the reality, and we have to say also behind the back of women. So we have a challenge here. We have to ask ourselves, what's the agenda for change so that this respect for the difference turns into more effective institutional models? I close by saying the key is to identify the interest that will represent the majority without denying or nullifying the interest of the minorities. Thank you very much. Carmen Moreno, the floor is yours. As this is the last time that I'm going to have the floor, I have to say thank you to the IFE, and I want to say thank you to the other entities and bodies that have organized this forum and therefore have invited us. Thank you very much for doing so. And I want to congratulate the chairman of the board of the IFE, Leonardo Valdez, for taking on the challenge of stating the need that in our next forum we have to talk about women and democracies. I think that, as we have just heard, many institutions have been created behind the back of women, and the effort to incorporate them and what they do in order to be part of them has not been as successful as it should. I'm not saying that we need to have more women just because we want to have more women. We want to have more women because otherwise we are not taking advantage of 52% of our population. We are wasting 52% of our economic force. We are wasting half of our possibilities. I think it is also very important to think that on this question on how to have a future with legitimacy in this environment of conflicts and tension, well, yesterday we had the participation of several speakers that talked about the core element as the human resources. So how to state a situation with legitimacy? Well, but the only way of doing it is by offering more respect, by offering more exercise of human rights. I think that by acknowledging the differences, by including the natives, by including the African descent, and you know very well that we're talking about millions in this continent, is very important to make a change in how we do our policy and how we begin with our public policies. We have to make all these focuses in a transversal manner with all the policies, security, development, democracy, etc. We are not going to have perfect democracy without the participation of women, and we are not going to have perfect democracy if we don't have the participation of the natives, of the indigenous population, and the African hyphenated populations. And I want to make one last comment because I think it's important. The most important challenge faced by women in this continent is violence against them, and violence begins in their homes, continues in the streets, follows them to the schools, and is being exercised by their family members, their closest beloved ones, and also by the factors of law enforcement, police officers, people in the street. I think we have to change that culture in order to have an adequate, complete, full democracy. I want to point out that this topic is very important. How can we analyze how to have more governability, how to have a more social cohesion and unity, and how can we progress into the future? I am totally convinced that we cannot reach the future in the conditions of violence under which we are right now. With this, we come to the end of this panel, and if I'm correct, this is the end of our day. And I think that we leave the table with the idea that the changes in democratic culture are long-term changes that have to begin at home, follow to the schools, and then go into public spaces. Legitimacy or legitimacies would be in the inclusion of majorities and minorities, and in the creation of new identities, picking up the local aspects with the global aspects and putting them together without creating pressure in the democratic systems by means of demands. Thank you very much to the panel members, and we shall gather again tomorrow. With this interesting and important insight, we wrap up our day of work. We begin tomorrow at 10 with another excellent keynote speech by the former president of Uruguay, Danilo Aston, and then we will have the presentation, the panel with Arturo Núñez, with Carlos Mesa, and with more